Imagine this. You're wearing layers, petticoats, corsets, and a hoop skirt so wide it could double as a camping tent. You're at a royal ball, sipping tea and exchanging pleasantries with nobles, when suddenly, nature calls. Now what? How do you lift all that fabric? Where do you even go? And more importantly, how on earth did women deal with menstruation while wearing all that? Welcome to the Victorian era, a time of elegance, rigid manners, and hygiene practices that will make your jaw drop. Back then, women were bundled up in crinolines and massive gowns. Think Queen Victoria. She made the style iconic. These ballooning dresses were more than fashion. They represented femininity, grace, and status. But underneath the elegance, a mess of daily challenges that history books tend to skip. To start, let's talk about toilets, or rather, the complete lack of them. In the early Victorian period, flushing toilets and sewer systems were still just ideas. The concept of a proper toilet hadn't caught on yet, so when nature called, you answered, wherever you were. Literally, behind trees, in open fields, even right inside your house. Yeah, you heard that right, inside. You've probably heard the phrase, "They didn't have a pot to piss in." It wasn't just colorful language. That pot was real, a chamber pot, a simple bowl for collecting human waste. And if you didn't have one, you had to step outside and hope no one saw you. As for the contents of those chamber pots, they didn't magically vanish. People, yes, even city dwellers, would fling them out the window, directly onto the streets below. That's why high-heeled shoes and umbrellas were more than style statements. They were survival gear in cities where it quite literally rained human waste. In Britain, the chamber pot even had a nickname, the jerry. These pots usually came with a lid. Not for politeness, mind you. It was more like a biohazard sign. This pot is full. Stay back. Now, if you were wealthy, you wouldn't see a jerry sitting in plain sight. But make no mistake, they were still everywhere, just hidden in fancy furniture or built into chairs. Servants would quietly roam the halls, checking and emptying them throughout the day. Because even the rich couldn't escape the basic facts of biology. In a fancy household, your bathroom might be a wooden bench with a hidden pot underneath. But the question remained, where did the waste go? Well, brace yourself. Enter the garderobe, a medieval-style toilet that hung off the side of a building. It was often positioned above streets or alleys. The solution to waste disposal: open the window and toss. To avoid splashing passers-by, people would shout, "Gardez l'eau," French for watch out for the water. A nice heads up that something gross was about to come raining down. The smell? Unbearable. Streets overflowed. Entire neighborhoods were literally stewing in human filth. In some areas, people built raised stone steps just so pedestrians could hop over the rivers of waste. Now here's where it gets weird, in a historical kind of way. During wars like the Napoleonic and English Civil Wars, government agents would actually go door to door collecting the contents of chamber pots. Why? Because they used the urine to make saltpeter, a critical ingredient in gunpowder. Yes, your pee could help fuel a war. Let's talk fashion, specifically women's clothing. Victorian women wore so many layers that undergarments like knickers weren't even necessary. All that swishing, swooshing fabric made it impossible to tell what was going on underneath. That's right. For a good chunk of the Victorian era, women walked around without underwear. It wasn't until crinolines, the big bell-shaped skirts, started catching gusts of wind and flipping women upside down in public that society whispered, maybe it's time for drawers. But even then, underwear didn't mean what you're thinking. Early Victorian drawers were crotchless. Yep, two pant legs, connected only at the waist, with a strategic split in the middle. The flaps overlapped, providing just enough coverage unless you squatted. Then they opened like theater curtains at showtime. Why the strange design? Because no woman wanted to lift 20 pounds of skirt, petticoats, and corsets every time she needed to pee. These open-crotch drawers allowed a lady to simply lower herself over a chamber pot. No squatting, no lifting, no drama. And yes, there was a technique. Women's chamber pots were oval-shaped and scooped on the inside, made to fit between the thighs. A well-practiced woman could slide the pot into place under her skirts, handle her business, and no one in the room would even notice. At grand events, there were special retiring rooms just for this purpose. Inside were multiple chamber pots and a team of maids ready to help. One would lift the lady's layers, another would slide the pot into place, and when it was all over, a quick wipe, and she'd be back on the dance floor like nothing ever happened. Of course, not everyone lived this gracefully. For most women, it was simpler and messier. Pot on the floor, skirts up, squat, and clean up with whatever was available. Old newspaper, leaves, even corn cobs. Yes, corn cobs. Which brings us to a very real, very awkward question. How did Victorians wipe? Let's get into it. One of the go-to tools was, in fact, a dried corn cob. No kernels, just cob. It was rotated like a lo-fi scrub brush. If that sounds painful, well, yeah. And they weren't one-and-done tools either. They were reused, sometimes cleaned, often not. Another favorite was the sea sponge on a stick. It would be dipped into a communal bucket filled with salt water or vinegar between uses. Then, back to work. Before you judge too hard, remember, ancient humans wiped with whatever the earth offered: rocks, dirt, clay. It wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. Other creative solutions? Leaves, straw, seashells, ouch. Anything absorbent was fair game. Eventually, as paper became more widely available, people began using newspapers, magazines, and catalogs. If last month's issue mysteriously vanished, there's a good chance it ended up in a chamber pot. Toilet paper as we know it didn't become a thing until the late 1800s, and even then, it wasn't widely adopted until the early 1900s. So for most of the Victorian era, the bathroom experience was far from refreshing. And now to the big one, the question everyone thinks but never asks. How did Victorian women manage their periods in those mountains of fabric and steel cage crinolines? Let's break it down. First, it's important to know that women during this time actually had fewer periods than women today. Why? 3 reasons. Puberty still hit around 12 to 14, but menopause often came much earlier, sometimes in the mid-30s. Poor nutrition and hard labor led to low body fat, which meant irregular or absent periods. But fewer doesn't mean none. When periods happened, there were no pads, tampons, or any disposable product. Women had to improvise. They wore a basic linen shift, long, washable, and the only thing protecting their expensive outerwear from body fluids. When bleeding started, many used what was called a T bandage. Picture a primitive bikini bottom tied at the waist, with a strip of cloth running between the legs. Inside, absorbent rags. If cloth wasn't available, women used moss, sheep's wool, or even grass, anything that would soak up blood. These materials weren't tossed out. They were washed, dried, and reused, again and again. And that's where we'll pause for now. Now that we've uncovered how Victorian women handled the, let's say, less glamorous aspects of their day-to-day lives, chamber pots, open-crotch drawers, and corn cobs, Let's dive deeper into the monthly mystery. How they managed menstruation in those towering gowns and steel-framed crinolines. Here's something that might surprise you. Victorian women actually had fewer periods than most women do today. No, it wasn't some magical benefit of the era. It came down to biology and brutal life conditions. While puberty began around the same time as it does now, between ages 12 and 14, menopause often hit earlier, sometimes as early as a woman's mid-30s. Add to that the daily grind of intense physical labor and poor nutrition, and you get lower body fat levels, which often meant irregular or missed periods altogether. But fewer doesn't mean none. Periods still happened, and when they did, women had to get incredibly creative, because there were no pads, no tampons, no painkillers, and certainly no heating pads or chocolate binges to make things better. So what did they do? For starters, women didn't wear tight-fitting underwear like we're used to today. The basic undergarment was something called a linen shift, a long, washable piece of clothing that protected the expensive layers on top from sweat, body oils, and yes, menstrual blood. But when bleeding started, they turned to a DIY solution, the T-bandage. Think of it as the great-great-grandmother of modern period underwear. It was basically a primitive bikini bottom, tied at the waist with a cloth strip running between the legs. This strip was packed with absorbent material, usually rags. If the woman couldn't afford cloth, she'd get resourceful. Moss, sheep's wool, or even dried grass might be used to soak up the blood. And these weren't disposable, not even close. These makeshift pads were washed, dried, and reused, over and over, month after month. Some women changed them 12 to 20 times a day, depending on their flow. It was messy, uncomfortable, and incredibly time-consuming. On lighter days, women sometimes just relied on their thick petticoats to absorb whatever came, hoping the layers would do their job and keep things from showing or smelling. And yes, that's as risky as it sounds. Eventually, as the Victorian era wore on, those infamous split-crotch drawers became more common. But don't be fooled. While they made it easier to use a chamber pot discreetly, they weren't built for menstruation. They offered little to no real protection. They were about convenience, not hygiene. And through it all, Victorian women were expected to maintain the image of perfect composure. Pain, odor, stains, those were private struggles. A proper lady endured them quietly, gracefully, beneath pounds of fabric and social pressure. So how did they keep all that clothing, especially those enormous, sweeping dresses, clean with all this mess happening underneath? Here's the short answer. They didn't. Not the way we think of cleaning today. Victorian laundry was no small task. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was an ordeal. Imagine boiling water in giant pots, scrubbing by hand with lye-based soap that burned your skin, hauling buckets up and down stairs, wringing out sopping clothes without a machine in sight. For many households, this backbreaking work was done only twice a year. That's right. The Great Wash came once every 6 months. And this wasn't because people were lazy or dirty. It was because fully washing a Victorian dress was often a death sentence for the garment. The water and soap could destroy delicate silks, satins, lace, and velvets. Instead, women relied on a kind of spot cleaning system. They'd sprinkle their dresses with talcum powder to absorb odors and oils, then use a brush to dust off the powder. And along with it, the sweat and grime. It was more about masking the smell than eliminating it. When a dress wasn't in use, it was carefully folded and stored in cedar-lined trunks or wardrobes designed to repel moths and bugs. These weren't just outfits. They were investments, works of craftsmanship made with care and meant to last. So women wore them until they were fraying at the seams, or until the smell was just too strong to ignore. But let's not forget the real unsung heroes of the Victorian wardrobe: the undergarments. Layers of petticoats, shifts, chemises, and crinolines acted as the first line of defense. They soaked up the sweat, the stains, and the smells, shielding the more valuable outer garments from ruin. And unlike the gowns, these base layers could be washed, often in boiling water, often by servants or laundresses who worked under grueling conditions. So while the outer look might scream elegance and opulence, underneath was a constant, sweaty battle to maintain the illusion. Victorian beauty came at a steep cost, not just money, but labor, discomfort, and hours of behind-the-scenes effort. Imagine wearing pounds of fabric in the summer heat with no deodorant, no fans, and no running water, and still being expected to glide through a ballroom like a porcelain doll. Now here's the million-dollar question. Would you do it? Would you trade your leggings and tank tops for corsets and shifts? Your air conditioning for a hand fan? Your menstrual pads for moss? Would you embrace the etiquette and elegance and all the discomfort that came with it? Maybe there's a romantic draw to the past, the fashion, the formality, the sense of ritual. But once you lift the veil, literally, it becomes clear that the beauty of the Victorian era was built on layers of sweat, secrecy, and a whole lot of scrubbing. But we're not done yet. Because for every question we've answered about life in the Victorian age, a dozen more lurk beneath those ruffled skirts. So in the next part, we'll peel back more layers, digging into the hidden world of health, beauty rituals, and what it really meant to be clean in an era when the nose had to be as polite as the lips. Let's keep peeling back the lace-trimmed layers of the Victorian world, this time to explore the strange and often shocking standards of health, cleanliness, and beauty. Because while those gowns were glamorous, what happened behind closed doors, or lack thereof, would make even the most die-hard vintage lover think twice. First, let's talk about what it meant to be clean in the Victorian era. The short answer? It didn't mean what it means today. Bathing, for starters, wasn't a daily habit. Not even for the upper class. In fact, for much of the early Victorian period, many people believed that too much bathing was actually dangerous. There was a common fear that hot water and open pores could invite disease into the body. So even wealthy individuals might bathe only once every few weeks, or even once a month, especially during winter. Instead of soap and water, many people turned to dry bathing methods. They'd use cloths to wipe down their skin, apply powders to absorb sweat and odor, and occasionally dab themselves with rose water or vinegar. The goal was more about masking smell than eliminating it. Now imagine being a servant tasked with preparing a bath for your employer. You'd have to haul bucket after bucket of boiling water up the stairs, mix it just right, and then maybe, you'd get a turn with the leftover water if it hadn't gone cold and cloudy. And yes, it was shared bathwater. The whole family might bathe in the same tub, one after the other, which might help explain why some people chose to just skip the whole ordeal. But hygiene wasn't just about washing. It extended into some truly baffling beauty standards. Take skincare, for example. Pale skin was all the rage. A white, almost translucent complexion was a sign that you weren't a laborer, that you lived a life of leisure untouched by the sun. But getting that look, it involved some dangerous chemistry. Victorian women applied products containing lead, mercury, and arsenic to their faces. These substances promised to purify the skin, bleaching away blemishes and evening out tone. but in reality, they caused everything from skin damage to full-blown poisoning. Some women even died for the sake of a porcelain complexion. And if you think the quest for beauty ended at the face, think again. Eyebrows were often plucked into thin, delicate lines, or shaved off entirely and penciled back in. Eyelashes? Fashionable women sometimes darkened them with soot or coal dust, using tiny brushes to dab it on. Yes, literal ash near your eyeballs. Unsurprisingly, this often led to eye infections. Teeth were another challenge. While some toothpaste did exist, it was rudimentary, made of crushed chalk, charcoal, or salt. And toothbrushes? They were carved from wood or bone, with stiff animal hair bristles. Dental hygiene wasn't exactly a high priority, and toothaches were common. The go-to solution? Extraction. No numbing agents, no Novocaine. Just a pair of forceps, a strong stomach, and maybe a belt to bite down on. And yet, amid all this discomfort and danger, society held women to impossibly high standards. You were expected to look flawless, smell pleasant, move gracefully, and keep silent about the endless work required to make all that happen. Let's not forget the corset, arguably the most iconic and controversial piece of Victorian fashion. Designed to cinch the waist and lift the bust, corsets created the hourglass silhouette that dominated the era. But wearing one wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a full-body commitment. Corsets were laced tightly, sometimes to the point of fainting. Women suffered from bruised ribs, restricted breathing, and even organ displacement. Some medical professionals of the time warned about the health effects, but the social pressure to have that perfect shape often won out. And it wasn't just for special occasions. Many women wore corsets every single day from girlhood into adulthood. Some even slept in them. Now imagine layering a corset over a chemise, then adding petticoats, a crinoline, a skirt, maybe an overskirt, then a bodice, plus gloves, shoes, a bonnet, and parasol, then stepping outside into 90-degree heat with no deodorant. That was just another Tuesday in Victorian England. Hair care was another time-consuming ritual. Washing your hair might only happen once a month, maybe less. Instead of shampoo, women used egg yolks, vinegar rinses, or even gin to cleanse the scalp. Combing and brushing were daily musts, with many women brushing their hair 100 strokes a night to distribute oils and prevent tangling. And long hair was the norm, often worn up in elaborate styles secured with pins and combs. Hairpieces and wigs were common too, sometimes made from real human hair. If you lost hair due to illness or stress, no problem. There were salons that sold mourning hairpieces made from your own locks. So let's take a step back and put this all in perspective. The Victorian era is often painted as a time of refinement, sophistication, and grace. And in many ways, it was. The art, architecture, literature, all of it reflected a society striving toward beauty and culture. But beneath the surface, life was messy, painful, exhausting. Behind every gorgeous gown was a woman who'd spent hours binding herself into it. Behind every polished ballroom dance was a bladder desperately waiting for a chamber pot. And behind every delicate smile was someone dealing with toothaches, menstruation, body odor, and social expectations so strict they left no room for complaint. So next time you scroll past a historical drama or costume ball and think, I was born in the wrong era, just remember, you're probably romanticizing the look, not the lifestyle. In reality, the Victorian world wasn't a fantasy. It was real, it was raw, and it was relentlessly human. So what do you think? Could you survive a week in Victorian London? Would you trade your running water, hot showers, and modern hygiene for corsets, talc, and tea bandages? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the underlayers of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. We've got plenty more secrets to uncover from the past. Because sometimes, the most fascinating stories aren't about royalty or war. They're about the quiet struggles hidden under lace, powder, and silk. Until next time, stay curious.